Hi, and welcome to the Human Side of Business podcast. I'm Ange McCabe, CEO and co-founder of Intuitive Performance. I'm a performance coach, HR professional, whole person leadership facilitator, and your host. The Human Side of Business podcast is fueled by the genuine curiosity to understand how personal characteristics and skills can be leveraged to drive individual and team performance, tangible outcomes, and ultimately organizational success within business. Each podcast is devoted to sharing knowledge, expanding our learning edges, and exploring the trends in corporate culture towards growing the emotional intelligence of organizations. I'm so glad you're here. We have a special guest on today's podcast. I shouldn't say special guest, but a returning guest, our own COO and co-founder of Intuitive Performance, Scott Russ. Welcome back, Scott.
Thanks, Ange. I'll take special guest.
Yeah, you like that?
Yeah, I'll take that.
Of course.
Can you introduce me like that in team meetings too?
I don't know if they'll interpret it the same way, though.
No, you don't think so, eh? Okay, whatever. It was worth a try.
E for effort, buddy. E for effort. Glad to have you back, though, on the Human Side of Business podcast. Scott and I have really been noticing a theme when it comes to coaching our clients, as well as speaking to other coaches, too, that there's this thing called the imposter syndrome. So we're going to unpack it a little bit today and jam on it so that you, our subscribership, can kind of reflect as you're listening to what we're talking about and see if there's an imposter that kind of creeps up for you, as well as tools and resources that you can lean into in future if it feels right for you or if it's a vibe.
All right. I like
it.
It.
So putting you on the hot seat, Scott. What have you been seeing?
I wonder if it'd be good to maybe kind of define imposter syndrome, at least in our own words. I'm sure people can look it up and find many definitions online.
Mm-hmm.
I know for me, I almost call it like that voice in the back of your head.
Right.
That thing that, shows up when maybe you're doing something that's uncomfortable or that is kind of holding you back from one space or another, and kind of lets you know all these reasons why you shouldn't be doing something. And so for me, that's kind of how I think about imposter syndrome and how it shows up. But I want to get your input as well.
Yeah, I really enjoy that. I mean, technically speaking, there's 5 different types of imposters. And this is why Scott and I work so well in business, because he gets down into the weeds to really define something so that we can look at things from a succinct manner. Whereas I'm like, okay, there's this thing, we're going to do this thing, right? So when we're talking about imposters, there's a perfectionist. So that's the kind of voice, using your word, Scott, that is in the back of your head that you can't let go of something or you can't delegate unless it's perfect, or you can't submit that blog until it's perfect, or maybe, you can't go for that promotion until you know that you've perfected your performance and your approach. Then there's the soloist. So it's like, it's not good enough unless I do it on my own. And it's not coming from a place of selfishness. That's actually what the imposter is telling us, that we have to be able to do it on our own. And if we can't do it on our own, then it's not good enough. Then there's a natural genius. And there's different titles for these types of things. But the crux of this is that, if it doesn't come easily to me from a place of cognitive or behaviors, etc., if it doesn't come naturally, then it's not good enough, and therefore neither am I. Then there's the expert. So I have to know every single thing about that thing before I can actually deliver on that thing. And then there's a superhuman. And oftentimes, I don't want to be generalized, but parent figures, I guess we'll say, they can have those guilt cards and feel like the superhuman. So they have to be able to wear the badge of putting in multiple hours at work and stay up with their kids if they're sick. And then also be able to be the PTA mom and or dad or person. And then also be in the community, right? So it's that superhuman figure or script that sometimes we can have in our minds. But it can be more hindering than helpful. So that's kind of the rundown of what types of voices. And of course, there's blends. You might have more than one perfectionist talking to you on different topics. I've definitely noticed that being vulnerable in myself at times, as well as others. And I really want to normalize this topic of imposter because there's a medical definition of it, but statistics tell us from Harvard Business is that 77% of the respondents of a particular survey had identified that they had some imposter syndrome and or aspects come up in their role. And that was a small sample size. So let's think about it from the larger scale to normalize the fact that we all may have some sort of insecurities all the way up to the actual imposter syndrome.
Someone came prepared.
I've been living and breathing this for like the past 2 years. Seriously. Like, I mean, you have to admit, Scott, like so Scott and I are both coaches, and sometimes we'll lean into each other from a place of confidence, but also respecting the confidentiality of our clients, of course, and say, hey, I'm coaching on this topic and there's this thing. And so, Scott, you got to admit that oftentimes when I'm talking about things, it backs into this topic. Like, it's almost like leaders and or professionals that come into us as of late, they want to, identify their next step in their performance, but underneath it all, there might be some sort of imposter. Or they'll come in and they'll talk about like, how can I be a better communicator? But what stems from that is that, they have to be a perfectionist in communication. So therefore they're holding themselves back, or it's a bit of a blind spot. So I feel like there's all these minor coaching topics at the top of the iceberg, but then underneath, that's what calls us to a higher place to really look within to see what is that actual root cause of the reason why I'm here for coaching.
No, and you're right, Ange. I mean, I think a lot of times when you start asking the question why, and you continue and ask it more and more, it starts to uncover, peel back the, lack of a better term, layers of the onion, so to speak, right?
Yeah,
and the more you dig down, the more it comes down to, at the end of the day, I'm holding myself back in one way or another. And so kind of coming back to what you had said, so recapping, there's 5 types of kind of imposters or blends of imposters that might come up around the perfectionist, the soloist, the genius, the expert, and the superhuman. We said that this was a hot seat. What's coming up for you? What kind of imposters play in your world?
I really enjoy the the toss back over the net there. Kudos to you.
Oh, I know it's going to come back my way. So
definitely that brother vibe in the room again. Speaking from a place of vulnerability, the imposter that comes up for me, I think, is a blend between expert and perfectionism. And it's really reared its head in the first 2 years of business when it comes to like the videography piece or in any position where I'd have to actually, quote unquote, expose myself and not kind of hide behind the Intuity Performance brand. That's been a learning edge for me. And so I would say at this point, I've done a lot of work in the sense of, confidence, and then also just trial and error. Like that has been, as simple as it sounds, that has been a confidence builder for me. Obviously still a work in progress. I feel like we're always on a journey with that type of stuff. But what I've noticed is the way that I internalize my beliefs around certain things really matters, because then that turns into how I speak to myself and therefore how I act, right? So for people that are more into formulas or prescriptives, when it comes to this type of stuff, in past, what I used to do is I would have this belief that if I didn't look a certain way, sound a certain way, exhibit myself a certain way, then I wasn't good enough, or what I have to say isn't from a place of expertise in comparison to Brene Brown. Not many people compare it to Brene Brown, right? So especially when we're thinking about a small business. So I would shy away from things. And then after the work that I've done, I'm not looking to compare myself to anybody else anymore. I'm looking to compare myself to myself a week ago or a month ago or a few months ago. And also having a lot of strong supports in the environment that we're in with Intuity Performance. I mean, Scott, you and I have had this conversation. You put me on the hot spot. What's getting in your way? What are your blind spots, and what's really holding you back here? And that self-reflection around making sure that I'm 1% better each time I step in front of the video camera.
All right. No, that's fantastic, Ange. I do want to acknowledge, 100 plus podcast episodes in, you've certainly broke through that barrier from a podcasting perspective and continue to show up on video and on stage with our clients and
Thank you.
The VPL cohorts and everything else. So
I think from my seat, which can also lean into leadership in general, is when you flip the script from myself, how do I look? How do I sound? How do I feel? How do I act? What are they going to think about me? And you
Mhm.
flip that lens to how can I give? Where does quality come from for my client? Where does quality come from for my team members? What can I do for them? When you turn
Mhm.
that attention around, I strongly feel that it changes something within you, and you can operate at a higher perspective or place, because you're not in a place of worry, you're in a place of giving.
I like the kind of flip the script, so to speak. And what I'm noticing even within that, you can let me know if this resonates or not. It's a
Mhm.
little bit of like, what do I have control over?
Right.
It's not so much of like, well, when I compare myself to others, there's always people better than you. There's always people less than you. And so you tend to lose in that game. And
Mhm.
you can't really control how you're compared to other people. But when you look at it from a place of abundance, well, that's something you do have control over in
Right.
terms of, well, how can I show up for my clients? How can I help do this better? How can I continue to improve that 1%? And
Right.
so yeah, I like that recap.
Definitely, definitely. And Scott, what have you seen from your seat as a coach over the past year when it comes to this quote unquote imposter? What kind of things kind of pop up in the sense of, business cases?
It's a good question. I think it depends who I'm coaching with, but let's say if we take it from the lens of management and leadership,
Mm,
um, I think it changes depending on what level of leadership you're in. If you're
that's
that
fair.
new kind of fresh manager, used to just have to manage yourself, you're an individual contributor, step into a role, now you're managing maybe the past 6 months, even a year or two, right? A lot of the concerns that I've heard that have kind of come up have been around how I'm being perceived by my team.
Mm,
And so it's a little bit of that lack of confidence in self, which makes sense, right? You don't have that experience yet in terms of
of
managing
course.
people, or maybe you haven't gone through the right training yet to help support you and provide you the tools to be able to do that. Quick plug there for a whole person leadership cohort.
I love it. I love it.
Check it
I think
out.
that's perfect.
But kind of building on that, as we go through our leadership journey, or even what I've seen just with the clients I've worked with, then from there, it's not so much around like, well, how can I manage my people, but how can I lead them forward? Right. And so now the
Mm,
concern isn't so much about, do they like me? Am I doing it right? And maybe those things never really go away. That happens too. But otherwise, it's stepping up even a little bit further as to, how can I show up in such a way that actually gets people behind the goal and actually
mhm.
gets people to help move forward? And I look at it a little bit from a tactical lens, just the way that I kind of operate from there. But I can imagine you have maybe some other instances or other stories to be able to share.
I like your thought process anecdotally, where it's your voice, or your anti-hero voice is what we call it at Intuitive Performance, is
Mhm.
always there. I think the differentiating factor is identifying, is it driving your proverbial bus? And if so, where do you really want your anti-voice to be? And oftentimes it doesn't totally go away, but it takes a back seat, or it gets really soft.
Mhm.
And I've always been interested in humans in general. Like, I'm definitely that type of person where I could sit and people watch all day and be like, I wonder what their story is, or what type of day are they having. But anyways, I'm a super curious person. So observing clients as they move through the anti-power superpower exercise with us at Intuitive Performance, what I've really started to notice is that their levels of self-awareness. So when my anti-power comes up, what are my triggers? What's going on here? That heightens. And then you can also see almost like a transition. So there's different areas where we didn't notice this anti-power kind of showing up in past, and now we do. So it's almost like you graduate or elevate to a different portion of dealing with your anti-power, and then knowing that you have your superpower. And what I mean by anti-power, superpower, your anti-power is your imposter, and your superpower is your opportunity to create how you actually want to be and show up as in a particular environment, situation, managerial conversation. Maybe you're doing a leadership retreat with your team members, and there's a certain way that you want to show up. So your superpower is kind of like your own superhero, in that you have control, to your point, as to how you want to show up for other people. And the definition of that really varies between clients and different people as to what that looks like based on their comfort level and what they're willing to do as well.
I think one of the things that is worth repeating here, and just talking about that superpower, when you said, how I want to show up, right? And it's saying, giving permission to yourself, say, hey, you can actually make those changes, right? Just because the anti-hero, that imposter, is the habit that's been developed and continue kind of, I taught, the voice in the head kind of thing that I was mentioning earlier, just because it's always been there doesn't mean it always has to be there. And recognizing that those things can change and you can step into that seat or that superpower around how I want to show up and what I like to be. Doesn't mean it happens overnight, but rather coming back to your 1% rule, right? If you can just make a small improvement next time, and maybe normally your anti-hero kind of takes over and really drives the bus. Well, maybe next time, you get a little bit better and they take a backseat a little bit sooner than they did the last time. And all you're doing is having progress over perfection and to continue to build upon yourself there. I think it's worth noting, the fact that this can be changed, even if you find yourself in a situation where, this is just the way I'm used to, or it's the way it's always been.
Exactly. And a few things come up for me as you're speaking to that, Scott. And I bring up this stat in many of our cohorts and group conversations or group coaching conversations because it's very purposeful. So I asked the question, when it comes to constructive versus positive feedback in a ratio, what do we need to see in children? And the answer is 5-to-1. So 5 positive or strength builders to 1 constructive piece of feedback. And then I'll ask the question, so what about adults? And 100% of the time, every leader, professional, etc., they identify that it's a lower ratio. It's actually higher. It's 6-to-1. And so now let's compute that into how we're talking to ourselves. So regardless of thinking about the 5 different characteristics of an imposter syndrome, how often is your imposter kind of beating you up internally or giving you constructive criticism versus your superpower, which would be the strength builders or the positive feedback, kind of having the mic or that proverbial script. So that's kind of how what was coming up for me as you were speaking to that piece. That's really important to speak about the superpower. The other thing that I've really noticed with coaching clients is that it's super easy to talk about the anti-power and super challenging at first to talk about the superpower. And that highlights a huge thing from a societal perspective, another total different conversation. But all that to say, it really draws attention to ensuring that you find the right resources if you're looking to elevate your leadership skills, if you're looking to really truly lead from a human-centric perspective, if you're looking to continue to build on your performance, regardless of if you're in leadership or not. It raises a huge eye-opening point for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting because I just kind of realized it as you were explaining that it's true. There's something that is uncomfortable about stepping into your superpower. And even if I look at it for myself, and I think about, how I wanted to show up differently and how I'm practicing to show up differently and how I'm quieting the storm, so to speak, or, dealing with my own imposter. But yeah, thinking about yourself in that realm can feel uncomfortable and can, it's a change of habit, change of script. And so what's been your experience around either, coaching clients and helping them bridge that gap of talking about myself in this way kind of feels sticky to, oh yeah, no, this is exciting. I want to step into this superpower and I'm starting to do it on a more regular basis.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's to normalize creating avatars. Right. And when I say that, I often do an exercise with clients, and it's not something that I've crafted. It's been passed down to me from my mentor and coach. I've heard of other coaches doing it, so I'm not. This isn't a claim to fame. But all this to say is that if we're talking about ourselves, it feels icky, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent in some circumstances, right? But if we're talking about a character, then you can be more objective. You can be out of that emotional brain and more into your kind of thinking or problem solving brain. So I always pitch the anti-power superpower avatar exercise to coaching clients. And there's only been one instance where they were like, no, that's not going to drive for me, because it's a fun little exercise where we paint the picture of this character. What do they look like? What do they sound like? What would you name them? Are they a cartoon? Are they a political figure? Are they an actor? Are they a thing maybe? And then once we get a hold of that, it's like, okay, so let's conversely think about the superpower and what do they look like? And what I've seen is that there's been blockages when people are trying to think of them relating themselves to that superpower because they're not there yet. And that's okay. That's the whole point of the exercise. So again, it's taking separation or division from that exercise and being like, okay, so when you think about leadership or when you think about that perfect performance in XYZ position, what does that superpower look like? How do they sound? What would you name them? Et cetera, et cetera. And then from there, we can do what's called experiential coaching. So then it's talking more and more about when do they show up? Because everybody has different occurrences or triggers. And then we talk about things, and this is kind of getting technical, but cue habit loops. So how do we replace the anti-power with the superpower? And how do we make that easy and justifiable for ourselves moving forward, right?
Yeah, no, I love it. Would it be helpful to touch on a little bit like the impacts of the imposter and how it shows up? And then maybe even providing some action steps as to like, what can people do if they're noticing that, hey, this resonates with me. Oh my gosh.
Absolutely.
I'm feeling this, what can I do about it?
Definitely. So hearing you in the sense of how it shows up in their role, when we think about in relation to the anti-power and sometimes the superpower, oftentimes the root cause is just that. So if, we're complaining or feeling like we can't get that promotion, oftentimes it's the anti-power that's holding us back. So it could be anywhere from, perfectionism, paralysis, analysis, people pleasing. I don't know if I said procrastination. So all of those things kind of come up as ear markers or flags to tell us that we need to go within and kind of look at what that actual root cause is. And because as a result, what we've been able to do is we've seen from our desks anyways, that 3 of our clients had received promotions once they did that work. There were another 2 clients that identified they were less stressful and could take on more work. So efficiencies in the workplace. There was another client that actually was promoted 2 roles above because they were able to unlock that in themselves and they totally flourished. So when it comes to ear markers, I think it's asking yourself the question of what's really getting in my way about this? And how am I impacting myself? Because oftentimes what can happen is we spend a lot of time blaming resources or environment or others. And in the first instance, I feel like where empowerment comes from is empowering ourselves to really understand ourselves and what's getting in our way. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, no, I think it is. I think to your point, you've identified some of the ear markers, some of the triggers to say, hey, maybe this is how I'm holding myself back or how my imposters are holding myself back. What about for those that maybe aren't in a position or haven't had coaching in the past? I think one thing, feel free to reach out. More than happy to offer an opportunity.
Absolutely.
To check in on that. But otherwise, what are maybe some of the resources or some other action steps someone might be able to do to try and start, combating this or start stepping into that superpower?
For sure. Of course. So there are, when it comes to resources, the imposter syndrome, there's a plethora of information and tools out there. So a simple Google search could tell you and really break down what imposter syndrome is. Some of them will have the free analysis or tests online, and you can understand which one you lean into. My belief is that there's not always just one imposter. So it's good to have multiple resources to lean into. So maybe you could get peer feedback at work, or you could ask and say, hey, I'm working on this thing around imposter syndrome. I'm thinking maybe I fit here. What do you think? and you ask that to your leadership, your direct leader, essentially. Other resources that you can lean into are, of course, coaches, because we're here to be your champion and advocate, but to call you to a higher place based on your agenda. And to me, obviously, I have that personal bias around that type of resource. But of course, there's other resources in the sense of there's a book, and it was written by two female broadcasters. I believe it's called The Confidence Code. Their names are escaping me right now. But there's books out there that speak to confidence and kind of the imposter syndrome and how to kind of work through that. And I'm sure there's free workbooks online as well.
Okay. No, that's fantastic. And I think building off the resources, one thing as you were just talking that kind of came up to mind, even just as a small action step, if you feel like you're being held back from an imposter syndrome perspective, is just raising your awareness as to, when is this showing up for you? Are there any themes around, when your imposter comes up or when you feel like you're kind of being held back? And that could be a really telltale sign as to maybe identifying what kind of imposter shows up for you. And also just allows you to understand, like, hey, if I'm going into the situation again, at least I know what to expect. I know this thing is going to happen to me, and I'm going to have this. I'll go back to my analogy of this voice in the back of my head that's going to tell me I'm not doing something right, or tell me my own some other story, where the story is for you. And so even just realizing that, I think, can have a big impact. At least prepare yourself a little bit, kind of going into these things. If you're not in a position to be able to kind of change it, that might be a good first step as well.
Absolutely. And when you said the word tasks, taking stock of the tasks where you feel like there's a blind spot or something holding you back, what came up in my brain was certain trends of portions of your job. So for example, is it public speaking, or is it report writing? Or is it, maybe it's running team meetings or something like that, right? Like it kind of came to more of a task oriented themed perspective for me. And the other thing that's coming up for me too, Scott, is, and this is a bit of a tangent, in parallel to this, I strongly believe that as adults, generally speaking, or professionals, understanding ourselves, because oftentimes what I've seen is that we're blaming the imposter syndrome when in actuality, we just need to understand our own behaviors, right? So as humans, we kind of fill in the blanks of what we don't know. So let's just say, before I started intuitive performance, I was a very high IS. That has since shifted. And so oftentimes when I spoke in the workplace, I would reflect back on myself, and then I would feel guilty because I was talking about myself and not the other person. I felt like I should have been giving to that person. So it was almost like I would shame myself for using those types of examples from that way. Then when I did my DISC report as an influencer, you're very much about human, a human-centric approach from the place of your own experiences. And that explained it and grounded me in that to understand, okay, but I need to learn to adapt in other areas for other people as well. And so bringing this back full cycle, it's normalizing our behavior, and then identifying what do we want to do with this information from there. So, it's looking at kind of our full self and not just in isolation to one particular piece.
Okay. And so just clarifying, so when you're talking about kind of that self-awareness piece for yourself, part of that was, so using like a DISC assessment, for example, and identifying how you show up and what your behaviors are, kind of help kind of that light bulb switch.
Absolutely. Yeah. And other quotants, I should say, to pay attention to are things like emotional intelligence, or how are we motivated? Maybe our resiliency quotient as well, right? Because again, the more information that you have about yourself, the more intentional decisions you can make in those particular areas.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess as we're kind of wrapping this up, Scott, what would you say are the top 3 things that we should really take away from today's session?
Ooh, top 3 things we should take away from today's session. See, now I feel like I'm in the hot seat. I'm no longer a special guest. What is this? So I think takeaways for me are, 1, the understanding of how imposter syndrome might be holding us back. I think is one definite one. From there is, and I'll be repeating myself here a little bit, but that self-awareness piece as to like, well, what situations or themes might you notice around how it's holding you back? And the last one here is, looking at that superpower, understanding that, hey, you know what, just because things have been this way before doesn't mean you can't change. And so change is available to you. It's hard, as we both know.
Yes.
It takes grit and resilience to keep that practice going. But at the end of the day, you can step into that superpower no matter how uncomfortable it might feel at first, and start living up to that, as you had mentioned, that higher self.
You took that challenge by the horns.
Not bad, not bad.
Wrapped up just fine.
Maybe you'll even have me back again.
I think everyone would like that, just to see the dynamic and what's going on in 2D performance, and some of the hot topics that we can jam on would be fantastic.
All right.
Yeah.
Do we want to touch on the our next whole person leadership cohort coming up? I know we have one coming up.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, shameless plug. So on September 20th is our next open cohort. So individual leaders can apply from any demographic or industry, I should say. And so we're taking applications now all the way up to, I believe, the end of August, if I recall correctly. You can certainly find out more information about the whole person leadership cohort by contacting us directly, or we have our landing page on our website as well at www.intuitiveperformance.com.
Yeah, we'll drop a link maybe to the program as well in the show notes.
That's a great idea.
Easy access to it.
Definitely. So yeah, that is what's going on with our whole person leadership cohort, the open one. And also too, for those listeners that have larger organizations, we also conduct our whole person leadership cohorts directly for businesses that have 5+ leaders type thing.
All right.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Okay. Well, thanks for having me again. And thanks for listening, guys.
Yes, likewise. Take good care, everyone. Thanks for listening to the Human Side of Business podcast. I'm glad you could join us. If you enjoyed today's episode and want to stay updated with our latest content, make sure to visit our website. The link can be found in the episode description, where you can subscribe to the podcast, sign up for our newsletter, and learn more about our whole person leadership services. Sounds interesting? Explore the whole person leadership cohort by Intuitive Performance, a unique program that offers unparalleled support to managers on every step of their leadership journey. Our program features evidence-based assessments, workbooks, group coaching, and interactive learning experiences to help you level up your leadership skills. Reach out today to apply to one of our upcoming cohorts. Until next time, take care and stay curious.